Hello everybody, Sparkster1701 here, and today, while we fight through the sufferings of a cold, we're going to take a look at the Siege version of Apeface. Apeface is one of the more recent releases for the Siege line, and of course he was reviewed as a G1 character not too long ago. Unfortunately, the G1 version doesn't stand up very well. Get back up there. Let's adjust some of these pieces here on his back. Maybe that'll keep him up. There we go. That's better. And as you can see, the toys really aren't that much different in size from each other. Just something that did impress me quite considerably. But thanks to some modern engineering, they've been able to make the new Apeface a little less clunky. So that helps it overall. Although it does have some of its own flaws, which of course I will point out as we go along. Apeface is, of course, a Headmaster Horror Con from the G1 line. Now, a Horror Con was a triple changer that had a robot mode, an airplane mode, and a creature mode. So they were quite famous in the G1 line since there was only two of them, Apeface here and Snapdragon, both of whom were rather popular characters on the market, and Hasbro already has confirmed that Snapdragon will be appearing in one of the future lines. They just have yet to confirm if he's coming with Earthrise or the one beyond Earthrise. So we'll just have to wait and see when we get ourselves Snapdragon. But for right now, we do get Apeface. Now, of course, besides the obvious comparisons, we will take a look at articulation and such. We'll start with the G1 version. Of course, the G1 version had this special feature. You could lower their chest plates, and you would see a mini tech spec reader that would show their speed, strength, and intelligence stats. Unfortunately, this did not get carried over into the new toy. As far as articulation goes, he can rotate his arm, but it can only go so far, as it runs into the kibble on the backside no matter where you have it. So he's limited on that. But he can raise his leg up at the hip all the way up to his chest, and he can bend his leg at the knee. So he can do some rather highly impressive kicks, just not look that good doing it. We're going to set G1 Apeface aside since he's not very cooperative right now. That'll give us more room to take a look at the modern Apeface. We can turn his head from side to side. He really can't look up and down, unfortunately, due to the way the head's designed. You can raise his arm up at the shoulder, about so far. And he can rotate his arm all the way around. You do have to shift it slightly to clear the wings. He does have a joint at the elbow, so you can bend his arm at the elbow about 90 degrees. And he does have a swivel at the bicep, so you can swivel his arms at the bicep. Now, while he can't be turned at the hips, you can spread his legs apart to do a full splits. You can raise his leg up at the hip about 90 degrees, and you can bend his leg at the knee about 90 degrees. And you can also raise his feet up. So he does have quite a range of motion. Now, before we get on to his transformation, we'll take a look at his accessories. Starting with his shield. Of course, I'd love to describe his accessories, but once again, they've written them in Cybertronian, and I don't have an app for that on my phone. Mainly because my phone is more antiquated than this toy. But this is his shield. Very similar to the one from the Generation 1 version. As you can see right here, it's very, very similar in shape, just considerably smaller. This one's also made of sturdier plastic, so it doesn't give at all. And of course, next we have his gun. Which is a fairly good-sized gun for a toy of his size. And it even retains the scope feature that's on the Generation 1 gun. And a few other design elements have been carried over from the original, so that's a nice homage to its original. I'm kind of glad they made it in black instead of red. That way it looks a little different. And then, of course, lastly, we have his head. Just like the original, this one is a headmaster. The backside has the gorilla head. But, of course, you can also fold it up, and it becomes a little robot. Now, while it's not implicitly named as such, this is intended to be Spasma. And in G1 continuity, Spasma was a Nebulon character who bonded with Apeface. Spasma was a rather nervous and insecure character, so bonding with Apeface changed his life, as he would be more the target of a bully like Apeface. So now he gets to relish in the fact that he has Apeface's backing in any situation. And of course, kind of like the G1 version, the legs form the face to Apeface. Alright, now that we've taken a look at that, let's change him into the alternate modes and see how they compare. Now here they are, both in Gorilla mode, G1 version on the left and the Siege version on the right. And quite a considerable difference on the two of them. The G1 version had very limited articulation, so it really couldn't stand in a normal pose for a gorilla. Or if it did, it just didn't look right. So it's something that is nicely done up by the Siege version. Of course, the Siege version, they also took the time to do some extra paint apps. As you can now clearly see his teeth. Whereas they were just simply molded on the G1 version and nothing was ever done with them. Of course, articulation-wise, the G1 version, you could rotate the arms most of the way around. The little robot arms get in the way. Plus, he could bend his arms at the elbow, like such, and he did have movable claws. Of course, also, the little legs could move at the knee. You could bend him at the knee both ways, and of course, he could also bend at the hip. But again, that was also limited by the robot arms in the way. So you really didn't get a lot of bang for your buck out of that Apeface. Now, what do we get with the Siege Apeface? Well, for one thing, he can hold all of his loose parts, as the shield can be optionally attached back here to hold the wings down. But they do show that the gun can be mounted there underneath the airplane cockpit, so that's a nice detail. The head, of course, is on a ball joint, so it can look up and down, and it can turn from side to side, just exactly like that. That's a nice detail. You can move his arms at the shoulders. Again, you have to move them out slightly so they clear everything, but they can move all the way out. You can move him at the elbow, like so. And, of course, you can extend the claws as necessary. And, of course, the back legs can also be rotated back just a bit. And he can also bend at the knee, only the one way. So let's see now. Why don't we see if we can get him into a similar standing position to the G1 version. Let's try that. Let's see how he looks. Looking like that. Get that foot straightened out. Remarkably, they have about the same amount of balance if they stand like that. So, more kudos for the Siege version to stand like a normal gorilla. Let's get them flipped into plane mode, folks. Shall we? Now, here they are, both in their airplane modes. And as you can see, they do look somewhat different from each other. This over here is the Generation 1 version. And while it's not easy to tell what type of plane it is, it did have some good swooshing ability from its old time. And, of course, the front cockpit opened up, where you could have Spasma sitting in the pilot's seat, which was always a nice touch. The only downside is there's no real place to attach the gun on this mode, so he doesn't get to take his gun with him. That's the downside. Of course, over here on the Siege version, they've addressed that issue. As you can see, the gun can be mounted underneath the cockpit. However, the cockpit is way, 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 way too small to hold Spasma. But we remove the shield piece here to remove the back wings, and as you can see, we have a much larger cockpit in the back of the plane, and that is where Spasma sits this time. Of course, you got to be careful with how you position Spasma in there. So it'll only fit in there the one way in order for it to close up entirely. So do be careful with that. This one also swooshes pretty good. Biggest pain I have with it is getting it all lined up correctly. It's a chore to line him up exactly the way he's supposed to be. Another problem I have is these wings. The wings here are very, very thin plastic, and I mean, while I haven't heard of any reports of any of them breaking yet, they are very thin, so you do want to watch how you handle them with great care. And also, if you have a child if you're going to give this to a child that gets easily frustrated, I would recommend passing on giving them Apeface until they've gotten the maturity to handle it. Because he is a bit of a frustrating one to transform. Alright, so now we get down to my final thoughts. What do I think of the Siege version of Apeface? I like the fact that they brought the character back, as the horror cons are somewhat on the obscure side. They came in too late to really get promoted in the cartoon. So most audiences really didn't get to see them in action. So it's nice to see that these popular toys are getting a new facelift for the modern era. Especially with they've already announced that Snapdragon will be released at some point. So that's good news to hear. It's a shame they weren't brought out together, which would have been nice, but this is cool. This will give us something to wait for, and I can live with that. I do love the improvements that the toy has made on the original in terms of the articulation. So the robot mode is definitely a lot better than the original. The gorilla mode certainly is a lot better than the original. The airplane mode, that's when we start getting into shaky territory. It kind of requires some precise lining up of parts, and on the triple changers I've noticed so far with the Siege line, they are a bit difficult to get everything exactly right. I had that trouble with Springer, and I've had that trouble with Apeface. At the time of this recording, Astro Train has not been released, so I don't have him to compare, but I am expecting he will be just as much of a pain in the butt to handle. But beyond that, if you can get beyond some of that and some of the other flaws of this toy, it's a great little toy. So I do commend them for not only bringing back a somewhat obscure character, but making a decent toy out of him as well. There's a lot less kibble to get in the way, and it's not quite as noticeable in some of the modes, but like the original, it's still noticeable, but I think we can forgive it more this go-around. So I think this Apeface deserves to be about in the middle tier. It's not quite perfect enough to make it into the top tier, but I think he's pretty darn close at getting into the top tier for it. If they'd only make them just a little bit easier to transform, I think this would definitely make a top tier toy. And that concludes my review of the Siege version of Apeface. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you liked the video, drop me a thumbs up here on YouTube. If you're new to the channel, please hit the subscribe button and join our ranks. Also, make sure to ring the bell so you'll be notified when I post new content. And unless they flag this video for kids, please leave your thoughts about Apeface in the comments section down below. This is Sparkster1701 saying I will catch you all later.